When choosing a Spey line for our first rod, it can be often difficult to sort out what it is we need. And part of that is to understand the difference between an overhead line and a Spey line. So today I'm working with 6 lines. I have an ordinary trout line. I have a Scandinavian shooting head. I have a Skagit head with a sink tip attached. I have what's called a short head Spey line, a mid-belly Spey line, and a long belly Spey line. What I'm going to do is discuss the tapers, discuss their lengths, and basically how thick they are, how heavy they are, and how they load the rod. So let's start with our little trout line. We go back about 8 feet to this point. The front taper is pretty well done with. It's finished. From this point on, we're looking at belly until we get to the rear taper and the running line. The tapers are quite short for overhead casting, and that's pretty normal. Some of these tapers can be 4 feet, 6 feet, 8 feet, 10 feet, but they're all in that ballpark. At the 10-foot mark, we have the loop-to-loop connection for the sink tip for the Skagit head. Now, in this case, the sink tip is 10 feet. It could be 15 feet or something in between, occasionally longer. Here we are at 30 feet, and this is the rating point for an AFTMA trout line. This being a 5-weight trout line, it takes 140 grains at 30 feet to load a typical 5-weight trout rod. This is also where the tapers stop, the front tapers stop on our short head and mid-belly Spey lines. So let's think about that for a moment. Our trout line stopped at 8 feet. Our Spey lines are stopping at 30 feet for the front tapers. It gives you an idea how important front tapers are for Spey lines. They have to be much, much longer than a standard overhead line. Now we're back at 40 feet. You can see our Skagit head is ended. There's a loop-to-loop connection to the running line, and our Scandinavian shooting head is also ended. Now the difference between these two lines are fairly simple. They're both basically the same length. However, the Skagit head will be shorter and blunter in the belly section. So it's basically a thick chunk of rope, if you want to think of it that way, with a sink tip at the end. Whereas the Scandinavian shooting head has a long taper, somewhere in the neighborhood of 25 to 30 feet long, and then a short, fat belly and a short little rear taper. They're both designed that way to load the rod for the particular style of casting that's used to fish them. Now we're back at 55 feet. This is the end of the head for the short head Spey line. The trout line ended back at 35 feet. Yet here we are at 55 feet, our short head ends. And the rear taper on this particular line is quite short. Here we are at 65 feet, and this is where our mid-belly Spey line ends. Believe it or not, with a good two-handed rod, you can pick up that full 65 feet and cast it. The rear taper on this is fairly short. It has a short, thick belly, and as I say, that 30-foot front taper on the front end. Now we're back at 90 feet. This is where our trout line ends. Most trout lines are around 90 feet. A few might be 80, a couple might be 105, that ballpark, but the vast majority are 90. What's interesting is our long belly Spey line. This is where the belly of the Spey line ends, and it has some rear taper that goes on from here. It goes back to about 100 feet for the rear taper. So you imagine that, the belly section on the long belly line is as long or longer than a standard trout line. Now we're back at 120 feet, and this is where our two Spey lines end, the mid-belly and the short head line. They end at 120 feet, but as you can see, our long belly line keeps on going. Here we are at 140 feet, and this is the end of the long belly line and where the backing starts. There are some long belly lines that are even longer, going back 150 and 160 feet. You need this length for championship type casting. Very, very good casters can actually shoot this entire line. That's amazing when you think about it. Think of the length here. We're up to 140 feet, and some people can put that full line out. There you have it. The basic differences between a typical trout line and the types of Spey lines that are on the market. Now this is a very important point. Just because you have a line at home that says 6-weight on the box doesn't mean you can go out and buy a 6-weight Spey rod and have that 6-weight trout line work on it. The differences in weight between a 6-weight trout line and a 6-weight Spey line are considerable. And as you can see by this, the lengths are quite different as well. So you have to be sure that you have the right line for the rod. If we're looking at Scandinavian lines, and Skagit lines are usually rated by weight rather than line number. So you don't usually see that often, for example, an 8-weight Skagit line. It'll go by weight instead, like 500 grains, 400 grains, that sort of thing. Scandinavian shooting heads are sometimes rated by grain weight, sometimes by grams, which is metric. Same thing, basically, you're rating it by weight. Or occasionally you'll see them according to a line rating number. So for example, this orange one is rated an 8.9. It's for an 8.9 Spey rod. Short head and mid head and long belly lines are rated by line rating numbers. So you have a 9.10 or a 10.11 or 7.8, and those match up typically with most Spey rods on the market, though there is more variation than you would normally find in trout fishing circles. Usually if you buy a 5-weight trout line and put on a 5-weight trout rod, it's going to work. Spey lines, a little bit more awkward to get a fit. It's not quite as precise. But nevertheless, it will get you close. So remember that. If you're going to go out and buy a Spey rod, you're also committed to buy the line to go with it. You can't go home and put your trout line, or your trout reel for that matter, and expect it to work.